Welcome to What Would Jane Do? We've reached episode 6, and today we're going to look at the satirical culture. That's the cartoons and the political jokes that were around at the time of Jane Austen. Now, I'm particularly interested in this because my very first book was all about the cartooning world and the theatre of the 1790s. That book's called The Diamond of Drury Lane. It's written for children but can be enjoyed by adults, and hopefully is soon going to be a stage musical. So I had great pleasure when I had the chance to talk to one of the world experts on this subject. That's David Taylor, and he'll tell you a little bit about his life and his studies as he looks at Jane Austen and the cartooning world of the early 19th century.
I am David Taylor. I'm an associate professor in the English faculty at Oxford and a fellow of St Hugh's College here as well. I specialise and teach 18th century literature, but my particular interests have been in the theatre of the 18th century and also in the satirical culture of the 18th century. In particular, my most recent book was about political cartoons in the period. So, particularly the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, exactly the time that Austen was living and writing, a period sometimes known as the golden age of caricature, the age that gave us the political cartoon as we really know it.
So tell us, what would these political cartoons look like? Describe a typical one that somebody might come across.
So we tend to think now of political cartoons as fairly small, that we would see in a newspaper, or sometimes now online as well. They're much larger for a start. Political cartoons are yet to appear in newspapers. That won't happen really until the very end of the 19th century. So in this period, in Austen's period, political cartoons are sold as single sheets that are engraved, single engraved sheets. You can buy them uncoloured, slightly cheaper. You can buy them coloured, they're a little bit more expensive. And they're much larger. They're much, much larger. They might be, say, about that large in size, even larger sometimes.
So you're doing there about A3 or something like that, or bigger than that?
Yeah, there's a great variation in size. They could easily be A3. Occasionally, even a little bit larger than that. So really quite different. We think of political cartoons as images that we might glance at, that we would expect to get the joke from in a matter of seconds. But what's interesting in the period is that people are buying and looking at cartoons in a different way. They're looking at them in far greater depth, so that the images are not just larger, they're often more detailed. They have more text, they have more details at the level of their iconography. And people would buy these individual sheets. They might paste them onto furniture, a fire screen, even a wall. If you go to Cork Abbey, the National Trust property in Derbyshire, you'll find a caricatural room where the owner has pasted these images to the wall of a particular room. More common.
So it's not out of all possibility that Mr Darcy, for example, might have a room dedicated to his caricatures.
Mr Darcy could well have a room dedicated to caricature. I mean, it was quite common to have a room, a print room in these large houses. That print room would more commonly have large engravings of paintings of classical scenes from classical Rome or whatever. The caricatural room of the kind we see at Cork is a kind of variation on that theme. More commonly, people would buy them and paste them into albums, and then they would get those albums out and they would look at them in a drawing room scene, perhaps after dinner, and it would be a social event, social activity. That these cartoons were designed to be looked at collectively in ways that we probably don't feel very familiar with now.
So as most people won't have seen or knowingly have seen an 18th century cartoon, what are they looking at? So if you've got a favourite one, perhaps you could describe what you actually are looking at.
So one of my favourite ones would feature the Prime Minister William Pitt, who is naked and incredibly skinny, emaciated, and he's riding a white horse. With a firebrand of a sword over these sprawling pigs, and the image the image is doing quite a lot. It's very detailed. It's also features a number of opposition politicians who are also sent sprawling by the Prime Minister's horse. And it's an image by the great political cartoonist of the period, James Gilray. And Gilray is satirising Pitt as death, the death on a pale horse from the Book of Revelations. What he's also doing with the pigs who are scattered is satirising the conservative writer Edmund Burke, who had described the masses or the mob in his book Reflections on the Revolution in France as the swinish multitude. It's a wonderful image that can be read in a whole host of ways, and indeed that's the beauty of images of this period, in that they reward extended reading. They encourage, they invite sustained reading, and often they play ambiguously in the way that we might not expect satirical cartoons to play now. We would expect the point to be fairly obvious. Someone like Gilray was a master of satirising both sides at the same time. Gilray was briefly awarded a government pension, money essentially, to work and for the government and satirise the opposition. But it wasn't an arrangement that worked, because Gilray was just too wild a satirist to be able to narrow his satire to one particular target. So his images are dense. They're if you see the amazingly, we have surviving some of his sketches for these images, and they're these frenzied pen and pencil lines as he creates these incredibly dense images which are just full of details. Every time I go back to an image like the one I've described, which was published in the early 1790s, I see something new.
So when you say after dinner people retire to the print room, this is what they're discussing.
Right.
They're able to see more in.
Yeah.
There's lots of references that one of them may pick up, and then somebody else will say, "Oh yes, but also it's doing this."
Absolutely, they reward a kind of mutual decoding, we might say. I mean, and it's so popular were they in album form that certain print sellers in London started renting out albums in the way that, I mean, it doesn't happen now, but 15 years ago we might have rented a DVD from our
blockbuster.
In many ways, it is a kind of blockbuster of the day. Exactly. What people are going to do for entertainment? Well, they can read, and that can be quite a social activity. They can go to the theatre, but one thing they can do is rent an album of satirical cartoons and spend the evening with company, laughing and thinking.
Okay, so we've got Jane Austen, who for much of her life is living in fairly retired circumstances, though she also does live in Bath for quite a few years. Where would she have seen cartoons?
So she would absolutely have seen cartoons in Bath, because of the standard practice for print sellers of the period, not just those selling the cartoons, but those selling any kind of reproductive print of portraits, of landscape paintings or whatever. The standard practice was that they would display their latest wares by posting them in the windows of their shops. So if you walked along a high street in late 18th century Bath, early 19th century Bath, what you would see as you passed a print shop would be a variety of images. Austen doesn't talk about the display of cartoons in any of her novels, but in Persuasion, her last published novel, the second half of which is located almost exclusively in Bath, one of the characters, Admiral Croft, is interrupted by the heroine, Anne Elliot, looking at a print shop window, and he's looking at an engraving of a naval scene featuring a ship. He's not particularly happy with the way that the ship's been represented. But it's quite possible that in the window that Admiral Croft was looking at, there may also have been, alongside prints of naval pictures, also some satirical prints. And certainly a shop like that in Bath would almost certainly have sold satirical cartoons alongside engravings of paintings. So it's almost certain that Austen would have encountered satirical images through on the high street. It would have been almost impossible for her to have avoided that to some extent, because it was such a common practice.
And do you see because it was such a big part of the culture of the time?
Yeah.
Do you see this at all reflected in how she writes?
Absolutely. I think that the term caricaturist is a useful one, right? Because it applies to someone like Gilray, who's working visually, he's working graphically with an art of exaggeration. But Austen is also a master of the art of exaggeration and moving between fully fleshed characters and what we would call caricatures, funny, comic, exaggerated characters. I mean, so in Persuasion, I was just talking about someone like Sir Walter Elliot, the father of the heroine, who is absurdly kind of vain and narcissistic, never really understands what's going on around him. He's so self-absorbed. Or, I mean, perhaps more famously, someone like Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, again, a kind of wonderful caricature of an anxious mother who's only concerned really for getting her daughters married. Or again, in Pride and Prejudice, someone like Mr. Collins. And Mr. Collins is a good example because, as Austen almost certainly would have seen, there were lots of satirical images at the time that satirised the clergy. Lots of, often quite gently, sent up the rhythms of clerical life, particularly in country communities, of exactly the kind that Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice is coming from.
Yes, you've also got, of course, Mr. Elton.
Yes,
another favourite in Emma.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another caricature of the socially climbing.
Mr. Elton's another excellent example of Austen honing her kind of satirical eye in on a clerical figure, absolutely. And what's one of the aspects of Austen's art which is most skillful is the manner in which her novels combine characters and caricatures, and indeed even move, a character who might seem something like a caricature suddenly becomes something like a character, or vice versa. So she suggests a fluidity between a notion of character as complex and highly developed, and a notion of character as exaggerated, as comically absurd. I think Austen is so clever that we often move in her novels between one and the other constantly.
We also were thinking about earlier, weren't we, before we started, we were chatting about this for the podcast, was the juvenile works.
Right.
Where she actually collaborates with her sister Cassandra on the history of England by a prejudiced historian.
Yes, yeah.
Perhaps you want to say a little bit about
what
you see in that work.
Well, so, I mean, what's fascinating, and in fact, Austen's juvenilia generally tells us a lot about how far she was training herself as not just an ironist, but a satirist. But we've also got in that work that she's collaborating with her sister Cassandra. We've got images, haven't we? That Cassandra has drawn. So again, linking Austen's art of writing to an equivalent kind of art of exaggeration in graphic form. So that I think that says something about the way that we can really connect, and people have started to connect a visual culture, the visual culture that Austen would have been familiar with Austen's mode of writing. I mean, perhaps the other thing that should be said when we're thinking about that juvenilia and her work with Cassandra and Cassandra's kind of illustrations, satirical illustrations, is that caricaturing, that is, the art of physiognomic exaggeration, was a very, very popular pastime in houses in the 18th century. The art of caricature came over from Italy to England with the grand tourists in the first half of the 18th century. What then happened was that it was taken up by public satirists as a useful form of satire, but it continued throughout the 18th century and into the early 19th century to be a common kind of domestic pursuit as well, not least with women. Women, often taught the skills of draftsmanship, would often, as a form of kind of play together, have engaged in caricature.
So, moving to our own day, one of the things that may surprise Jane Austen is that her own works have occasionally popped up in political caricatures of our time. I think you have found a couple, 2 or 3 of these. So what images within Austen have you found crossing over into our popular culture now to make political points?
Right. I mean, so the most most common way in which Austen has recently been used in cartoons is since she became the face on the £10 note. So there was a cartoon by the cartoonist for the Times, Peter Brooks, in 2017, just after Theresa May lost, in a big surprise, lost her majority in the general election of that year, and instead of Austen on the front of the £10 note, it was Theresa May. In the background, you had the Houses of Parliament crumbling away, and the quote that features on the £10 note in England, the famous first line of Pride and Prejudice, is a truth, university knowledge, etc., etc., is now in this cartoon with May on the front. It is a truth, university knowledge that I am, and then a rude word that suggests that she's in real trouble. So yeah, I was like, family audience. So that's one example, and there's some other cartoonists who've also played with the idea of Austen as the face of the £10 note. But another way in which Austen's featured in recent years in cartoons, in 2010, Colin Firth, ahead of the general election in 2010 in the UK, Colin Firth backed the Liberal Democrats, and of course Colin Firth absolutely always shadowed by the part he most famously embodied, Mr Darcy. By the end of 2010, by which time the Liberal Democrats had joined the Conservatives in a coalition government and had rather controversially backed an increase in student tuition fees, which had been one of the scrapping of tuition fees having been one of their major policy points before the general election. Colin Firth kind of rather publicly disavowed the Liberal Democrats. That this happened at the end of the year, in December 2010. And so in December 2010, there's a cartoon showing Colin Firth as Mr Darcy with his wet shirt emerging from the lake. And someone in the background is noting that in his swim, his Lib Dem rosette seems to have detached itself and disappears. So what's interesting there is that famous scene, not from Austen's novel, but from the BBC adaptation of the novel, is being used to suggest a kind of political cleansing of some kind of a purification, a shift of identity. So that's a particularly interesting recent cartoon.
And the final question I've got for you on this, of course, is what do you think Jane Austen would have thought of this use of her work, even if it's a remove like the Colin Firth example?
I think she would have laughed. I think she'd have found it hilarious. I think she'd probably also have realised that it's a huge tribute to her, because cartoonists are only going to use ideas, languages, images that are readily recognisable. So in many ways, there's no greater sign of how important Austen is to our culture, how far her name is an instantly recognisable one, how far certain of her lines and certain of her characters are instantly recognisable to the general public. So there's no greater tribute to Austen, really, and sign of her cultural significance than her appearance in these cartoons. So I think she'd have laughed. I think she might also have been flattered.
Thank you. So that was with thanks to David Taylor from St Hugh's College, Oxford. We had so much we wanted to talk about that we also went on to talk about Jane Austen and the theatre. So if you come back and listen to episode 7 in this podcast, you'll find us discussing the world of Mansfield Park and London and Bath and all the theatrical performances that Jane Austen would have seen. But until then, when in doubt, don't forget you can always ask yourself, what would Jane do?